Hey guys, Buildzoid here, and today we're finally going to be doing the AM5, noteworthy AM5 motherboards list. So the way this list works is very simple. Motherboards get onto the list by having an interesting set of features at a competitive price point. And when I say competitive price point, I basically mean the cheapest motherboard to offer that set of features. Now then, so that's how motherboards get onto the list. And the first thing I would like to address is that the performance difference between, say, a ASRock B650M-HDV, which is the cheapest motherboard on this list at around $130 US, and, say, an MSI Meg X670E Ace, which is the most expensive motherboard on this list, at best is like 10%. Because the memory overclocking on this is limited by the CPU. The memory overclocking on this is also limited by the CPU. The main difference that you'll see in terms of performance between a B650M-HDV and, say, an X670E Ace is that the Ace has an external clock gen, so if you get lucky with your silicon, you might be able to push the the external clock gen to, say, 105, maybe even 110, and then you're going to get something between like a 5 to 10% performance uplift in certain workloads. Not all workloads, because not all workloads will actually have that much clock headroom, but you get the idea. So you might see up to a 10% performance uplift if you buy something that's like $700. Now, to be fair, there are other motherboards that have external clock gens, and those made it into the list for having the feature of the external clock gen. I don't consider it really a, like, necessary feature on AM5 because it really doesn't make that much of a difference, and it is really expensive. Like, the cheapest boards with an external clock gen are all over $300. So, you know, you can spend like 2 to 3 times more on your motherboard to get maybe 5 to 10% more CPU performance, which I think is silly, because if your BIOS randomly got reset, I don't think you'd be able to tell the difference. Anyway, not without running a benchmark, right? Like in regular usage, I don't think you'd be able to tell the difference. So anyway, with that out of the way, let's get into it. Starting off with the cheapest motherboard on the list, which is the ASRock B650M-HDV/M.2, which is a weird name for a motherboard, but whatever. So yeah, this tends to be around $130 US, and it basically does everything you need and nothing extra. And when I say need, I mean desperately need. Like, you only get your 6 USB Type-A ports. You do get BIOS flashback, which is now a standard feature of AM5. Every single motherboard has this. BIOS flashback is present on all boards. You do get one USB Type-C port and a basic set of audio ports. In terms of power delivery, this will power even a 7950X just fine. In fact, it'll even overclock a 7950X, because Ryzen CPUs are thermally limited, not power limited. That's very different from the Intel side where, well, you're still very thermally limited, but if you build a big enough cooling system, you can get 13th gen CPUs to pull just absurd amounts of power, which is not true for Ryzen 7000 series CPUs. The board does have some basic troubleshooting LEDs, so it'll light up as it's posting. Unfortunately, these are all the same color, but they do at least light up in like a more interesting sequence than just one at a time, so you can kind of better tell what part of the post process it's in. But yeah, it's I wish they were color-coded. That would be better. You do get 2 M.2 slots on the board. You get a Gen 4 X16 and then a Gen 4x4 off of the CPU. You also get 4 SATA ports. Really, if you're just doing a basic gaming build around a 7800X3D, this is, in my opinion, the go-to motherboard. Right? Like, if you are basically, if you're building a Ryzen 7000 system and you don't have any like special requirements like I need a ton of M.2 slots, or I need a ton of USB ports, or I need I need a postcode, I really want an external clock gen because I really care about 5% more CPU performance, or you get like there, you can have requirements. You might want Thunderbolt ports, 10 gig LAN. This board kind of does board things, the basic functionality of a motherboard that you need in order to have a functional computer. This will do it. It'll even overclock, just not a 7800X3D, because it doesn't have the external clock gen. But it'll overclock all the other CPUs, because for those you don't need an external clock gen. Now, admittedly, your tuning options are a lot more limited without the external clock gen. So, anyway, yeah, just a really solid, like, basic motherboard option as far as I'm concerned. And this is the motherboard that is like, well, if you're going to be buying something more expensive than this, you should have a specific reason for why you want something more expensive than this. So let's take a look at something more expensive, and see some of the reasons that you might consider it. So this is a Gigabyte B650M Aorus Elite AX. Obviously, it has a more powerful VRM. That doesn't really actually make much of a difference because the Ryzen 7000 chips are not really limited by power delivery at all. In fact, this motherboard could probably run a 7950X and Prime 95 small FFTs with a static overclock with the VRM heatsink removed. Because I've done that with a 14-phase motherboard, and it was just fine. And this isn't actually a 14-phase. This is like 12 power stages running in a 6-phase configuration. But in terms of current handling capacity, the phase count itself doesn't actually make that much of a difference. It's just about how many low-side MOSFETs you have in parallel, because that's where the bulk of the current is flowing through most of the time. Anyway, and when I say bulk of the current, I mean like 90% of it. Anyway, so yeah, you get a kind of not relevant VRM upgrade. You get some better cooling for the M.2s. You do still only get 2 M.2 slots. The X16 Gen 4 is still the same. Well, yeah, it's X16 Gen 4 and then a Gen 4x4 at the bottom. One of the M.2 slots is Gen 5, but that was already true on this board as well. Yep, Gen 5 on the one of the M.2 slots. So the reason you would actually consider this, you also get like basic troubleshooting LEDs. No, they're not color-coded. You get 4 SATA ports, same as the HDV. So you might be like, okay, why would I get this instead of the HDV? It's the rear I/O. You get Wi-Fi built in. You get a lot more USB Type-A ports. You still get 2.5 gig LAN, and you also get an optical output instead of no optical. So depending on what kind of external audio solution you have, this might actually be just a requirement that you desperately need. And yeah, the ASRock board just doesn't do that. This tends to go for around $190. So you get some, extra functionality, but CPU performance-wise, this and this are going to be the same. Anyway, up next we have the B650E Riptide. So now we've gone full size and we get a lot more connectors for doing that. Well, not necessarily. Wait. Oh, this one doesn't have the rear I/O photo. I preferred the old ASRock website. It's this layout much more consistent in terms of what was available in terms of pictures. But yeah, so you don't get quite as many USB Type-A ports as you get on the B650M Aorus Elite AX in the rear I/O. You also don't have the optical output anymore, but you get a better PCIe configuration just because there's more space between the PCIe slots. So you still get you get the Gen 5 M.2. This is also the cheapest motherboard to offer a Gen 5 X16 slot. I don't know why you would actually care about that, because currently the only thing that you can, it's not, I guess you might be insane and put like 5 Gen 5 M.2 SSDs into your main PCIe slot, but for most people that PCIe slot is for their GPU, and an RTX 4090 is PCIe 4.0, so Gen 5 doesn't do anything for you there. Anyway, but this being an ATX board, it does have more space for M.2 slots, and so it gets 3 of them in total instead of just 2, which we saw on the MATX boards. You still only get 4 SATA ports. There's also still troubleshooting LEDs. The thing with the M.2 slots on this board is that they're a bit weird in terms of speeds. So you get one that's Gen 5, which is standard for most AM5 motherboards. You get one that's Gen 3x2, which is the weird one. And you get a Gen 4x4. So yeah, it's like not, like one of these is like really meant for like bulk storage than things that you actually want to load really quickly. But hey, you do have the option of more M.2 drives, and you also have the 4 SATA ports, so you can kind of pack a lot more storage onto this board. Well, not really a lot more, but you can pack more storage onto this board than onto the MATX boards. Also, that PCIe, the PCIe X4 slot is 3.0 X4. And what I really like about it, though, is that it's all the way at the bottom of the motherboard. So if you're putting like a capture card or something into it, it won't get into the airflow of your GPU, which can significantly increase the amount of noise a GPU produces. It's like putting an add-in card directly in front of a GPU. It won't necessarily affect the thermals that much, but it can produce a lot more noise, as like the air having to go around the restriction causes a bunch of extra turbulence, and that can get loud depending on the design of the GPU that you're putting a capture card, like putting an add-in card in front of, right? And that could be like 10 gig LAN or something. So yeah, also this does have Wi-Fi built in. So a interesting motherboard if you need sort of more internal connectors, compared to say the, Aorus Elite AX. And this goes for around $220. Also at around $220, we have the ASRock B650 Live Mixer. And this has a really cool set of connectivity features for this price point. This is awesome. Like, look at this rear I/O. It's totally packed with USB ports. I'm a big fan of that. You also have the optical audio output, so yeah, like you're not even losing that compared to the Elite AX, unlike with the Riptide. Now, this doesn't have a Gen 5 X16 slot, which I don't really think is much of a loss. You do still have a Gen 5 M.2. Your other two M.2 slots on this board are Gen 4x4. Yeah, you can see here. You get two Gen 4x4 slots and one Gen 5x4 slot on this board, so 3 in total still, but they are now faster than on the well, all of them are now at least as fast or faster than what you had on the Riptide. Now, the one downside to this is that the very bottom PCIe slot in this motherboard actually shares bandwidth with one of the M.2 slots. And when I say shares, I mean you can have one or the other. They can't be both plugged in because PCIe lanes don't magically multiply themselves, unfortunately. If they could, that'd be really cool, but they don't. Also, you do still have a CPU-attached PCIe slot, that X4, but now it's in the middle. So you do run into that potential issue of like, well, if I put a 10 gig LAN card in there or a capture card or whatever, it might screw up the airflow into the GPU and then your GPU might get kind of loud. But that's, like, it depends. Really depends. And yeah, in terms of connectivity options, this is a really interesting loadout of like M.2 and PCIe connectivity. The sacrifice here is the SATA ports. There's 2 of them. Not really a big deal if you're doing a new build, but if you're migrating from an older system and you have like a bunch of SATA drives that you've just been carrying forward from like past builds, this is a potential issue. And the reason I point it out is that's actually relevant to me, because I did buy one of these mostly for the color scheme, and yeah, the 2 SATA ports are like my biggest gripe with this motherboard. Is just like, man, I would totally daily this if it just had one more SATA port. I guess I could use an add-in card for that if I really wanted to. Or just, like, you know, migrate all of my data onto a bigger drive or something. Or onto an M.2 driver or whatever. Anyway, so yeah, this has a really interesting just rear I/O configuration. And then some really cool internal connectivity. As long as you don't need a ton of SATA ports. Because there basically is just 2. It does have troubleshooting LEDs. And in terms of the VRM, this is actually the same VRM as the Riptide. It'll overclock a 7950X just fine. Memory overclocking works just fine. The only real complaint is this is an ASRock board, so you might find that there are certain settings in the BIOS that the board don't do anything because they're like features that they forgot to remove. And the main one that I'm thinking of with this is the BCLK settings. Even the HDV has BCLK settings that look like there's an external clock gen on the board, but there isn't. They don't do anything. So yeah, and that's also a problem with the live mixer. Is that there is a extra BCLK option that does nothing because there isn't an external clock gen. Anyway, let's move on to a more expensive board, the Asus ProArt B650 Creator. Now this is at around $260 instead of around $220, and the reason it's in the list is very simple. It has dual X8 PCIe slots off of the CPU. This is the cheapest motherboard that does dual X8. So this is perfect if you're doing like a 3D rendering workstation or something and you want to run like dual Quadro GPUs. You can't really run dual 4090s on this unless you water cool them or you find some 4090 with a like 3-slot or 2-slot heatsink, because yeah, this doesn't have 4-slot spacing between the PCIe slots. So that's like basically the biggest flaw if you're trying to build a rendering, like GPU rendering system around this board, is just your GPUs won't necessarily fit. But yeah, it has dual X8, and that is a very uncommon feature on AM5 just sort of in general. So it's really cool that there's like a motherboard at the $260 price point that offers this functionality, because it is quite rare. You do also get 3 M.2 slots on this board. You also get 4 SATA ports, you get some basic troubleshooting LEDs. They are color-coded, at the very least, but this being a workstation-ish board, I really think it should have had a postcode, because that used to be a standard feature of like workstation boards from Asus, was that they have a postcode. Because if your workstation doesn't want to turn on, that's kind of a problem. And it would be nice to be able to tell why it doesn't want to turn on faster, right, than just having to rely on some color-coded LEDs. And there is one sort of major downside to this board compared to like other boards in this price range, which is the rear I/O. there are like no USB Type-A ports, by which I mean there's 5 of them, which in my opinion is very much nowhere near enough. This is just like not acceptable. This is not enough USB Type-A. You do, however, get a full set of audio ports. You do get 2.5 gig and 1 gig LAN. These are both Realtek. So you get like dual LAN functionality. Not sure what you'd really do with it, but there are some people that want that. You also get BIOS flashback as standard for AM5. And I did want to check the actual like gens of the M.2 slots. Oh, and you get a X6 4.0 by 4 slot off of the chipset at the very bottom of the motherboard, and a 4.0 by 1 also off of the chipset. The bottom PCIe slot shares bandwidth with one of the M.2 slots. So again, if you can either have 3 M.2 drives, or you can have 3 PCIe like X4 devices, or well, like 3 PCIe cards. You can't have 3 of everything at the same time. There's simply not enough bandwidth in the B650 chipset to do that. Funnily enough, there's not really enough bandwidth in the X670 chipset either. But the thing is, because the X670 chipset just daisy chains the chipsets off of each other. So like you're not actually getting more bandwidth, but you do get more flexibility in terms of how many connectors there are. Anyway, in terms of the M.2 slots, you get 2 connected directly to the CPU. These are 5.0 and 4.0 X4, and then you get 1 off of the chipset, which is 4.0 X4. So yeah, a pretty interesting board, as long as you don't need, like if you want dual X8 and you don't care about rear I/O, or like don't care about USB Type-A ports, because there aren't very many of them here. But yeah, definitely an interesting option if you're trying to build like a GPU rendering setup or a machine learning setup and you need like multi-GPU support. This is one of the cheapest board, actually literally the cheapest board with dual X8. So that's how that got into the list. Next up, we have our cheapest X670E motherboard, the Phantom Gaming Lightning. This just packs a whole bunch of connectivity, because that's kind of the idea of the X670 chipset. It's the B650 chipset with another B650 chipset glued to it, so you get more ports. I'm pretty sure if you tried to use them all at the same time, you would actually hit a bandwidth bottleneck at the like chipset to CPU connection. But as long as you don't try to use all of them, you do get more ports, like at the same time, as in like they can all be populated at the same time, but like if you tried to like write and read and write from all of them at the same time, that would potentially cause an issue. Anyway, so the rear I/O on this is very strong, except there's no audio, like optical output, which yeah, kind of annoying, because this board is also around $260. We are doing the motherboards in like from cheapest to most expensive, so yeah, this is also around $260. You do get a ton of USB Type-A, though, which I'm a big fan of. You get 2.5 gig LAN, and then internally, you get 4 M.2 slots, but they're like ASRock M.2 slots, so their bandwidths are just all over the place, right? So you get a Gen 5 by 4, which is standard. You get a Gen 3 by 4 off of the chipset. You get a Gen 4 by 2 off of the chipset, and a Gen 4 by 4 off of the chipset. So you have like you have literally 4 different speed M.2 slots on this board, or like 4 different configurations of M.2 slot on this board at the same time. They're not actually 4 different speeds, because like you have one that's very, very fast, and then you have 2 that are technically the same speed, but they achieve that speed in very different connector configurations. And then you have one that's like in between the 2 slow ones and the one fast one, which is the Gen 4 by 4. You also get 4 SATA ports, and the nice thing is that it looks like, yeah, none of these are actually sharing bandwidth with each other like they do on, say, B650 boards. So you can have all of the M.2s and all of the PCIe slots at the same time. You get a PCIe 5.0 X16 off of the CPU, and a 4.0 by 4 off of the CPU, which is the bottom PCIe slot, I think. Wait. Okay, no, that's the middle one. Yeah, because you have that 1X over here. That 1X isn't really useful because your GPU will cover it up, so good luck actually getting anything in there. But you do get the 4.0 by 4 on this X16 slot over here. So again, you run into that, like, whatever you put in there is directly in front of your GPU, which might not be ideal. And then you get that bottom one off of the chipset as well. Yeah, so you get a lot of, like, interesting connectivity options with this board, both with the rear I/O and then internally with like the 4 M.2 slots, 4 SATA ports, bunch of PCIe lanes, which, you know, is possible thanks to the X670E chipset being two B650 chipsets glued together. VRM is, actually, I would be surprised if this wasn't basically the same VRM that ASRock has on their cheaper boards. Not that VRM is bad, like it's perfectly capable of powering any Ryzen 7000 series CPU, so that's not really a concern. But yeah, this is mainly just a connectivity upgrade over the cheaper boards on the B650E chipset. Anyway, up next we have the cheapest motherboard to offer a postcode. There's actually kind of two of these, but one of them is having like weird availability issues. There's the Asus ROG Strix B650E-E Gaming Wi-Fi. This thing is $350 and that is the least amount of money you can spend to get a postcode, which I think is completely insane, but here we are. Anyway, so the reason this board is in the list is because it does have a postcode. And then you might be looking at these PCIe slots and going like, oh, it does dual X8, right? Wrong. This does X8, X4. Because reasons. And that reason is that Asus has far more expensive motherboards with postcodes and dual X8, and they would prefer it if you bought one of those rather than this. But anyway, the PCIe configuration on this motherboard is actually my least favorite part of it, because otherwise it would have been really interesting. Because here's what Asus decided to do with the PCIe lanes. You get X16, right, on the primary slot, and then if you use the secondary slot, you get X8, X4, and the reason you get X8, X4 is because 4 of the PCIe lanes from this X16 slot actually go into an M.2 slot. Yeah, so if you use all of the M.2 slots on this board, admittedly it does have a lot of them, there's 4 M.2 slots on this motherboard in total, but yeah, if you use all 4 of them, your GPU drops down to X8. Not a big deal. A 4090 on X8 4.0 is basically the same speed as it is at X16 4.0, but yeah, this is just like, I don't like the inflexibility of M.2 slots. You can very easily convert a PCIe slot into more M.2 slots. Going the other way, especially going from like 2 M.2 X4s back to an X8, it's not really an option. So yeah, I don't like this. And Asus is aware that people want dual X8 functionality, but, you know, you can't have dual X8 and a postcode at a reasonable price. That's just not allowed. And to be fair to Asus, most other motherboard vendors, actually some motherboard vendors, don't bother to offer dual X8 functionality at all. Like Gigabyte. They just do not have a motherboard that offers dual X8 whatsoever, which I find incredibly annoying. Anyway, so yeah, you get a lot of M.2 slots, but the consequence is wackiness with your PCIe lanes. There is a 4.0x4 off of the chipset, which does not seem to share bandwidth with anything. So I'm not sure why they have a double asterisk next to that. But anyway, the other nice thing about this board is the rear I/O, though. So this board is sort of like, this has a lot of connectivity. It just has, and the cool thing about, there is one upside to the way Asus has configured their PCIe lanes here, is that you can technically plug in everything on this motherboard and nothing gets disabled, right? Like on say the live mixer board, like one of these M.2 slots is literally like, you either have the X4 PCIe slot at the bottom, or you have one of the M.2 slots. You can't have both at the same time. With this, you can have all of the M.2s, all of the PCIe slots, all of the SATA ports, and I think all of the rear I/O plugged in at the same time, and nothing will get disabled. I'm pretty sure you're going to hit some kind of bandwidth bottleneck if you actually try to use everything at the same time in that scenario, but nothing will be disconnected. So that's the upside to doing this. I'm still not a fan of it. Personally, I would have preferred 3 M.2 slots and dual X8 support instead of 4 M.2 slots and X8, X4. Depending on your use case, this might really not affect you whatsoever. And this board does have a postcode, which is pretty cool. But as far as I know, it does not have an external clock gen. which is quite unfortunate because in this price range you can get motherboards with external clock gens, like say the B650E Aorus Master. Unfortunately, this motherboard does equally silly things with his PCIe lanes, because Gigabyte decided that it would be really funny if you could have 4 Gen 5 M.2 SSDs at the same time. Apparently, that's a thing that people want. They must do a lot of file copying. Like, a lot of file copying. So yeah, if you're a file copying enthusiast, here's a motherboard that has 4 Gen 5 M.2 slots at around the $350 US price point. At least that's its MSRP. In practice, this motherboard seems to show up more at around the $400 US price point, and it does have availability issues, which might be related to the fact that the VRM on some of these has a bug where it just shuts down on AVX workloads. And I know that because I have one. Gigabyte actually ended up sending me 2 B650E Aorus Masters because they sent me one, and that one just shuts down if you try to run Cinebench R20 on it. And then they sent another one, and that one works great. This is actually a really good board if you get a working one. And yeah, I'm not sure what's going on with that. Because I have seen some people buy B650. I've heard from some people that they bought a B650E Master at retail, and it had the bugged out VRM. And I've also heard from people who have a B650E Master that they bought retail, and they have no issues with it whatsoever. So, yeah, I'm not sure what's going on with that. Other than that, this board also has a postcode. So if it was $350 US, it would be, direct competition for cheapest postcode with the Asus Strix board. But with the availability being what it is, that's kind of, yeah. And it also has an external clock gen. And as far as I know, this would be the cheapest motherboard with an external clock gen if Gigabyte actually did a good job of keeping this board in stock at the MSRP, which as far as I can tell, they aren't. And yeah, so I hope Gigabyte can figure out what is going on with this board, because if it was actually available at its MSRP, reliably, and it they fixed the VRM issue, what's really weird about this is the same VRM as the X670E Master. Literally the same parts. Exactly the same parts. I don't get it. But, yeah, so, it shouldn't even be a difficult fix as far as I can tell, because the X670E board doesn't have issues, and it's the same VRM. Exactly the same. Actually, I think the inductors might be different, but that shouldn't affect the VRM turning off in AVX workloads. Mind you, it isn't dangerous to the CPU. I did check it with the oscilloscope. It just turns off. It doesn't do anything unexpected. It's not tripping some kind of over voltage protection type deal. It actually looks like it's tripping over current protection for reasons I can't explain, which is fine. That's not going to hurt the CPU. It's just, it's the equivalent of if you turned off your power supply while the system is running. Anyway, yeah, so that. And then the rear I/O on this board is also really solid, at least if you're a big fan of USB Type-A ports, which I am. Yeah, this board is kind of it's expensive. Really, the main reason to get it is the 4 Gen 5 M.2 slots, but it does have ECLK support. It does have a postcode. If you can find a working one, it's a really good board. I don't know how hard that is to do, because, yeah, I'm not going to go to a store and, test 100. And also, maybe some stores get, a good batch, right? And so some retailers might only have working ones, and some might not. So I really don't know what's going on with this, but this board is good. This is a good board if you get one that works. It's just also really expensive, and I personally think having 4 Gen 5 M.2 slots is really silly. I'd much rather have dual X8 support, especially since the hardware required for dual X8 support is the same as the hardware required for doing what Gigabyte did with the M.2 slots here. So, yeah. Anyway, up next we have the ASRock B650E Taichi, and this board is so a lot of the past ASRock boards that we went through, right, you have some really interesting internal connectivity options, lots of PCIe lanes, lots of M.2 slots, especially on, say, a live mixer. And then you get to the B650E Taichi, and you might be looking at this going oh, this has dual X8 support. No, it doesn't. This is X16 Gen 5 and 4.0x4 off of the chipset. Yeah. But you do get a postcode, and you do have an external clock gen on this board, which is how it got into the list. The rear I/O also packs a lot of USB Type-A ports and a Thunderbolt port and an optical out and like a really nicely featured rear I/O combined with like a postcode, external clock gen, and then you look at the PCIe lane configuration, and this is literally worse than a B650E Live mixer. Also, this is $370-ish US dollars, so this is not a cheap board. But yeah, so this is an interesting one. Like, it makes sense if your number one priority is just like a single GPU setup. You also only get like 3 M.2 slots on board, right? You get one Gen 5x4 and then two Gen 4x4s. So yeah, internal connectivity on this board is like weirdly limited relative to the price it's at, right? Like both the Gigabyte and the Strix and the Gigabyte board both have 4 M.2 slots, both of them achieving them in wacky ways, but they are technically there. There's also this, if you want 4 M.2 slots without any wacky PCIe things going on. And then there's this, which comes in at $370, so it's significantly more expensive than all of the other boards, has less M.2 slots, and doesn't even have, like, 2 PCIe slots connected directly to the CPU. So, like, an interesting test bench board, maybe? No, and well, depends on your needs for your daily system, right? A lot of people will just have a GPU and that's it. And if you're one of those people that just has a GPU and some drives, this is great. If you're not one of those people, this is potentially an issue because running certain add-in cards through the chipset can have problems. Right? So, yeah, that's like, it still gets into the list because you do, like, this is the cheapest board one of the cheapest boards to have a, postcode and external clock. Actually, yeah, the only other motherboard with a postcode and an external clock gen is the Aorus Master. So, and the Master has some issues surrounding it. This doesn't. So, that's a thing. So if you really want to push your 7800X 3D by, 5-ish%, maybe a bit more than that, this is probably your best bet. I think it's kind of ridiculous to be spending like close to 3 times what the B650M HDV costs for a 5% external clock gen overclock, but you do get some other upgrades, right? Like extra USB ports, that kind of thing. But yeah, this is a board that like basically wasn't really gonna be in the list, but then I was like, well, maybe somebody really, really wants an external clock gen, and they don't want to master for reasons, which I can understand those reasons. And in that case, yeah, this is an option. It's not, in terms of connectivity internally, I'm not a big fan of it, but if you just want a clock gen and a postcode, this is definitely a solid option. Also, it does have a Thunderbolt port. So yeah, if you want that, then it's an option for that functionality as well. Anyway, let's go up in price. So now we're at $440 with the MPG X670 Carbon Wi-Fi, and this motherboard has my favorite connector configuration and one tiny little problem. It doesn't have an external clock gen. It's $440, and it doesn't have an external clock gen. This is ridiculous. But it does have a really cool connectivity configuration. So you get 2 Gen 5 M.2 slots, Gen 5x4 M.2 slots, built into the board. These are both connected directly to the CPU, and you still get dual X8 PCIe support. Because there is enough PCIe lanes to do that. It's just like, for some reason, most motherboard manufacturers just refuse to do that for reasons I don't understand. So yeah, you get dual Gen 5x4 M.2s on the board. You get dual X8 Gen 5 support also on the PCIe slots. There's a Gen 4x4 off of the chipset. There's also 2 Gen 4x4 M.2 slots off of the chipset, so you get 4 M.2 slots built into the board. You also get 6 SATA ports. There might be some like bandwidth sharing going on with the SATA ports and the M.2 slots. You'll have to check the manual for that. You get a very solid rear I/O, right? Lots of USB Type-A, Wi-Fi 6E, clear CMOS, BIOS flashback, smart button, which can be rebound. Like, MSI says this can do safe boot. I really doubt that. Like, Gigabyte says they have a safe boot button. doesn't, in my experience, it doesn't work. Asus has some motherboards that should have a working safe boot button. In my experience, it doesn't work. So I have serious doubts that the safe boot functionality on this actually works, but maybe MSI figured it out because yeah, it really is like as far as I know, the issue with getting safe boot to work on AMD motherboards is that AMD has like their own safe boot procedure that isn't very reliable. And if you want to implement your own safe boot procedure, it somehow has to override the AMD one. And that's apparently a problem, which is why it just like never works. But anyway, if this does work, that's really cool. Yeah, so really solid rear I/O options on this board, has a postcode, and then the one complaint is just like it doesn't have an external clock gen. If this had an external clock gen, this would basically be the it does everything motherboard, right? Because it kind of does, right? We've got like the best piece, optimal PCIe lane configuration, all of the M.2s, 6 SATA ports, postcode, solid rear I/O, and then it's just like, and it doesn't have an external clock gen. So yeah, it's kind of a bummer. But if you're not buying a 7800X3D, or even if you are buying a 7800X3D, the external clock gen, it's not that big a deal. Like I said, it doesn't make that much of a difference to the performance. It's like 5 to 10% depending on how far you actually manage to push the CPU, how lucky you get with the CPU, and what workload you're running, because certain workloads will basically not benefit whatsoever from the external clock gen. Yeah, I think if this board was like $10 more and it had the external clock gen, I would like it a lot more because it would just tick all of the boxes instead of like 95% of the boxes, right? Like it does right now. Anyway, let's move on to a motherboard that ticks far fewer boxes, but adds some weird ones. The ProArt X670E Creator Wi-Fi. And when I say weird ones, I consider Thunderbolt ports weird, okay? It's just, I consider them like an exotic connectivity option that I've never used, I don't plan to ever use, but people like it, so, I do include it in these roundup lists. Anyway, so yeah, the X670E Creator Wi-Fi has 10 gig LAN and 2.5 gig LAN, solid decent number of USB Type A ports. It does have 2 Thunderbolt ports using the Intel controller. Like for some reason, AMD motherboard manufacturers just don't like referring to their Intel Thunderbolt controllers on AMD motherboards as being Thunderbolt. I don't know why. If you actually go into the driver page for a lot of these motherboards, it's labeled as Thunderbolt drivers, so it's Thunderbolt, right? But yeah. This does have a DisplayPort input, so you actually get display pass-through on this board, which is a pretty neat feature that some people want. You don't get an optical out for some reason, so if you're doing an audio workstation, this might be kind of a problem, depending on what kind of audio setup you have. But yeah, that's a really weird thing to be missing on a $440 motherboard. There's also no postcode again, because workstations don't have boot up issues, according to Asus. The workstations never fail to post. You don't need a postcode. Again, the reason I'm ripping on the postcode is this is a $440 US motherboard, but also postcodes were a standard feature of Asus workstation boards for years. And now they're just gone. I guess because Asus thinks that if you're building a workstation and you want a postcode, you should go buy an ROG board instead. That's probably the reasoning from Asus. And admittedly, the ROG boards are more expensive. So yeah, I can see the profit motive there clearly. Anyway, this does also have dual X8 PCIe support. Dual X8, you also get one PCIe slot off of the chipset. Again, the PCIe slot spacing on this won't take dual 4090s unless you water cool them or something, because 4090s are just absolutely massive. But if you're running dual quadros or something, it's fine. The same is true for actually every other motherboard that we've gone through. So far, none of the dual X8 boards. Actually, I don't think there's a single dual X8 board in this list that actually has spacing for 4090s, because there's one board that does that, and I think that's a really weird requirement, so I didn't bother to include it. Actually, no, there's 2 boards that do that. So if you're looking for those, you won't have a hard time finding them. You won't be thrilled about the price point when you do find them, but you're buying two 4090s, so I guess spending insane amounts of money is probably just kind of the way it goes when you're building a dual 4090 rendering setup. You could also just use risers or something to save a bunch of money. Anyway, yeah, you do get four M.2 slots, 5.0, 5.0, well, two 5.0 X4 off of the CPU, and then two 4.0 X4 off of the chipsets. You do only get 4 SATA ports instead of 6 that you get on some other X670E boards. But yeah, all around a very, like, if you need the connectivity options this board offers, it's a really solid option for that. Though, I will point out that the 10 gig LAN being built into the board at $440 is not actually that useful, because you can get 10 gig LAN add-in cards for like $50. And then you can buy, so you could buy your $50 add-in card and stick it into, say, like a live mixer or a rip. Actually, I'm not sure if it would work on the rip side. You could definitely stick it into a live mixer. You could definitely stick it into, well, yeah, you could stick it into one of these if you're willing to give up your, actually, that bottom chipset slot Gen 4, yeah, this is Gen 4x4. So you could put that 10 gig LAN card into the Gen 4x4. At the bottom of the board. You might even be able to do it on the Riptide as well as potentially. Actually, yeah, you could actually totally put a Gen 4x4 because this PCIe slot is Gen 4x4. Same is true for the HDV. So if you really want 10 gig LAN, you can just buy a 10 gig LAN card for like $50 and stick it into like a $200 motherboard, and you're still going to be, you know, significantly below the price of the ProArt. In fact, you can get dual 10 gig LAN cards for like $150. And if you stick that into a $200 motherboard, it's still cheaper than a ProArt. And now you have two 10 gig ports instead of just one. So the 10 gig on this motherboard isn't really I would not consider it like a good selling point for the board. This is really more a case of like you want Thunderbolt and the 10 gig LAN and the dual X8. Like you want the actual full combination of features that this motherboard offers rather than any one individual feature. I think probably the biggest highlight is the actual DisplayPort pass-through, because that is very, very rare. In fact, this might be the only board that does this, the DisplayPort pass-through. Because there are other Thunderbolt boards, but they don't do DisplayPort pass-through. Speaking of which, the $500 X670E Taichi. This also has two Thunderbolt ports, more USB Type-A, but it doesn't have a display pass-through port. Yeah, there's no DisplayPort input anywhere on the motherboard, so you can't actually do display pass-through on the two Thunderbolt ports that it has, which is rather unfortunate. Also, this board is $500. It does do dual X8 on the PCIe slot, which is nice. On the PCIe slots, which is nice. It has four M.2. Is it four? Yeah, it has four M.2 drives built in. However, you only get one Gen 5x4. The others are Gen 4x4. You get 8 SATA ports, which is very rare on AM5, but at the same time, I'm not sure why you would want 8 SATA ports on an AM5 motherboard. Unless you're building like a storage server, but like, really? Yeah, like in that scenario, I feel like you could just buy one of the cheaper boards with like and use like a PCIe to SATA add-in card, and probably get significantly more SATA ports that way than by buying an X670E Taichi. So really, the reason this gets into the list is because, you know, dual X8, postcode, clock gen. Really, it kind of covers a lot of the same points that the X670E Carbon does from MSI, except it is $60 more expensive, and you don't get two Gen 5 M.2 slots, which the Carbon does have. The rear I.O. is arguably a bit weaker, but at the same time, it does have an external clock gen. So, yeah, it's sort of like it addresses one of the issues of the Carbon while making some trades that you might find acceptable or unacceptable, depending on what exactly you're looking for in your motherboard. Oh yeah, you get a cut down set of audio ports compared to the Carbon as well. So yeah, this isn't, I wouldn't really consider the Taichi an upgrade as much of a side grade, which is why the like $500 price tag is like really not great in my opinion. I really wonder why ASRock didn't opt for like a smaller VRM that's cheaper, because putting 24 105 amp smart power stages on an AM5 motherboard is utterly pointless. Like, it really is just completely pointless. There is no reason to do this. And they did it twice. The B650E Taichi has the exact same VRM. If they literally cut half the VRM off and made the board like $20 cheaper, I would find it a lot more interesting. Same goes here, except this one I wish was even more cheaper than just like a $20 price cut, which, depending on how much they're paying for the power stage, it could be more than $20 price cut. But yeah, anyway, so the X670E Tai Chi has some interesting connectivity options at a not that interesting price tag. And then we get to the $700 Meg X670E Ace. This is basically a do-everything motherboard. There's just one thing it doesn't do, because of course there is. It doesn't do Thunderbolt. But it does everything else. So in the rear I/O, you get a bunch of USB Type-A, bunch of USB Type-C ports, full set of audio ports, Wi-Fi 6E, 10 giga Quantia LAN, the same set of buttons that you find on the Carbon. You get a postcode, like internally you get a postcode, you get X16 0x4 support off of the CPU, X8, X8, X4 off of the CPU. So all of the PCIe slots on this board are actually wired to the CPU, which is really cool. And you get 4 M.2 slots on the board itself. So the board also comes with an M.2 add-in card. So you can technically pack, like, out of the box, this board will allow you to pack like 6 M.2 SSDs onto it by using the add-in card, which I think is kind of cheating, because you can buy any motherboard with dual X8 and then use an add-in card to get your 2 extra M.2 SSDs on there. But this board does that, like, the board already comes with it, so you don't have to buy that separately. Not really a big value add, but like, it's kind of neat that it does include that, especially at the $700 price point, when you kind of expect to get a bunch of extras with your board. Other than that, it does have dual BIOS. It's one of the very few motherboards to have dual BIOS, which is pretty neat. It also has voltage read points. It also has an external clock gen. This is basically a do-everything board, right? It addresses the, like, one shortcoming of the Carbon without actually making any other sacrifices. Is just a straight upgrade from the Carbon in terms of functionality. And then it adds also like dual BIOS and stuff. So, yeah, but this is $700. And as long as you don't want all of the functionality of this board at the same time, you can get basically most of the functionality for a significantly lower price with some of the other motherboards that we've gone over. So, yeah, so like you have your 10 gig LAN, but I really think this is the best part of this board, is the CPU, like all of the PCIe lanes are just directly from the CPU, so depending on what you're doing, that can be very, very helpful. Yeah, that's it for the noteworthy motherboard list. There's a lot of other motherboards that obviously didn't make it into the list, not because they're bad, just because they're not, like, some people will buy a motherboard because it looks cool. I don't really think that's a sensible way to shop for motherboards, but hey, if you want to buy a motherboard because you think it looks good, actually, no, I've done that. I've literally done that. I bought one of these. Yeah, if you're buying a motherboard on aesthetics reasoning, or you really like Asus BIOS and you hate everybody else's BIOS, so you just have to have an Asus motherboard, or you really like MSI BIOS, which is like my case, which isn't really, like, for me, it's not really, I must have an MSI board. It's just like, yeah, generally speaking, MSI's BIOS is the least messy as far as I'm concerned, and it's the easiest to navigate. If you have like specific brand preferences or something like that, there are obviously other options that I didn't cover here, because you can kind of get well, no, there's one exception. Gigabyte literally doesn't have a single dual X8 PCIe motherboard at all for AM5, which I am so annoyed about, because that is one of the features I care about a lot, mostly because I do like multi-GPU benching. So yeah, I kind of want dual X8 slots. Like, they don't even need to support SLI. I'm perfectly happy to run like dual 290 R9 290s or something, but like, yeah, Gigabyte doesn't have a motherboard that does that, which kind of annoys me. Yeah, for most other functionality, you can generally find options from every brand. They're just not necessarily going to be at the lowest price point. So, like, everybody has a 10 gig LAN motherboard. Everybody has... Actually, I'm not sure that everybody has a Thunderbolt board. But, yeah. So, really, the deciding thing with AM5 motherboards, like, is what kind of connectivity do you need? or if you don't care about, like, again, there are people who just buy motherboards based on aesthetics, in which case, you know, like, yeah, just that's a perfectly valid way of buying a board, but I don't know why you need any research then, because, you know, you're just buying a board because it looks cool. So that's like anti-research as far as I'm concerned. Um, but yeah, so there's a lot of boards that didn't make it into the list because they just don't offer a particularly interesting set of features at a low enough price point. Even if they have like a, you know, like feature parity with the, say, the Tai Chi or something, if the board is like $100 or $200 more expensive and has the same functionality, I would just buy the cheaper one. I see no reason to pay extra to get the same functionality, because the more expensive AM5 boards, they are not faster. Really, the only thing that makes a significant performance difference with AM5 motherboards in terms of like CPU performance is the external clock gen. And well, you can get that on this, and you can get that on this. And admittedly, these are both very expensive at around, you know, $350 to $400. And also that external clock gen is only going to translate to like a maybe 5 to 10% performance advantage compared to a motherboard that's literally 130. But, you know, like that, like if you care about performance, that's basically the limit of your criteria, in my opinion. Is just like, I need an external clock gen. And then it's like, okay. But otherwise, it's just what connectors do you want, and then buy the cheapest one. Because in terms of powering a Ryzen 7000 series CPU, it's not like Intel. They don't pull that much power. You don't need that much power delivery. And in terms of, and then if you, especially the 7800X3D just doesn't need any power delivery. Like, you can very easily run a 7800X3D on like a 4-phase motherboard, which isn't even really a thing for AM5, right? So that's kind of the thing, is like if you're building a system around a 7800X3D, things like power delivery are just utterly irrelevant to the CPU's performance because it doesn't pull any power. So yeah. Anyway, hopefully you found this video helpful, and yeah. So I guess that's the end of the video. So like, share, subscribe, leave any comments, questions, suggestions down in the comment section below. If you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, I do have a Patreon. There's a link to that down in the description below. There's also the AHOC Teespring store where you can pick up shirts, hoodies, posters, you know, the usual YouTuber merch. And I've also got a Bandcamp, which you might want to check out. There's links to all of that down in the description below. And yeah, it would be much appreciated if you support the channel. So that's it for the video. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.